March 1967. Phuoc Tui Province. The long green, that suffocating carpet of jungle where visibility dropped to 3 meters, and every shadow could hide a battalion. Staff Sergeant Bill Hendricks, United States Army advisor attached to ARVN forces, had been summoned to examine what locals were already calling the silent massacre. 12 Viet Cong bodies arranged in a perfect kill radius of 9 meters. No brass casings from return fire scattered in the mud. No blood trails leading into the undergrowth. No survivors crawling toward the tree line. The point man's boot was still raised mid-step, frozen in rigor mortis, as if death had arrived faster than his nervous system could process the command to flee. Hendricks had called in B-52 airstrikes that couldn't achieve this surgical precision. He'd watched entire American companies fail to spring ambushes half this clean. But 4 Australians, just 4, hiding in scrub no thicker than a suburban hedge, had just erased an entire VC squad without a single enemy round fired in response. But this was only the beginning of the mystery. The patrol leader responsible for this carnage was Sergeant Terry Byrne. Second tour with Sabre Squadron. The most requested point man in the entire Australian task force. The operator whose ambush techniques were so devastatingly lethal that Massacre SOG, the most elite American Special Operations unit in Vietnam, had formally requested his methods be classified, not to protect them from enemy intelligence, not to preserve tactical advantage, but because American commanders flatly refused to believe the kill ratios were mathematically possible. Byrne's 4-man patrol had achieved in 2 seconds what American battalions couldn't accomplish in 2 weeks, and the Pentagon wanted to know how. The answer would challenge everything Americans thought they knew about warfare. To understand what happened in that jungle clearing, we need to examine a tactical philosophy that American forces found simultaneously primitive and terrifyingly effective. The Australian SAS didn't fight the Vietnam War the way their American allies did. They didn't call in airstrikes at the first sign of contact. They didn't rely on overwhelming firepower. They didn't measure success in body counts generated by artillery barrages. Instead, they became something else entirely. Jungle predators who could remain motionless for 10 days, who could track human prey using techniques learned from Aboriginal hunters, who could kill an entire squad before the victims even knew they were being watched. The Americans had helicopters, napalm, and B-52 bombers. The Australians had patience, silence, and an intimate understanding of how to turn the jungle itself into a weapon. The contrast couldn't have been more stark, or more humiliating for U.S. commanders. American Special Operations Doctrine in 1967 emphasized rapid insertion, aggressive patrolling, and immediate extraction after contact. Get in, make noise, call for support, get out. The Australian approach was the exact opposite. Their patrols would insert silently, move perhaps 200 meters per day, sometimes less, and spend the vast majority of their time motionless, watching, listening, waiting. An American LRRP team might cover 10 kilometers in a single patrol. An Australian SAS team might cover 1. But the Australian team would know every trail intersection, every water source, every likely enemy camp in their area of operations. They weren't conducting reconnaissance. They were establishing dominance over terrain in a way American forces never achieved. And then, there was the matter of the ambush itself. The ghost ambush, as it came to be known among American intelligence officers, represented a tactical innovation that defied conventional military thinking. Standard ambush doctrine called for establishing a kill zone, positioning automatic weapons at the flanks, and initiating with a command-detonated explosive. Maximum firepower, maximum chaos, maximum casualties. The Australian method was radically different. 4 men, 4 weapons. Absolute silence until the moment of initiation, and then, in the space of a single heartbeat, 12 aimed shots delivered with the precision of a firing squad. No automatic fire, no grenades, no second volleys needed. Just 12 bodies and 4 Australians melting back into the jungle before the gunsmoke cleared. The VC officer who triggered this particular massacre never knew he was walking into a trap. Intelligence reports reconstructed from captured documents later revealed the patrol's mission. A 12-man reconnaissance element probing Australian positions near Nui Dat. Experienced fighters, most of them, veterans of multiple engagements against both ARVN and American forces. Their commander, a lieutenant with 3 years of jungle warfare experience, had personally led over 40 successful operations. He knew how to read terrain. He knew how to detect American ambushes, the telltale signs of recently disturbed vegetation, the faint smell of insect repellent, the glint of metal in filtered sunlight. What he didn't know was that Australian SAS operators had spent 3 days preparing a position that didn't look like a position at all. The Australians had become the jungle itself. Sergeant Byrne's patrol had selected the ambush site 72 hours before the contact. A gentle curve in a well-used trail, where the vegetation formed a natural choke point. Nothing obvious. No convenient fallen logs to hide behind. No dense thickets that screamed, quote, to just ordinary jungle. Unremarkable terrain that any experienced VC commander would assess as low risk. And that was precisely the point. The 4 Australians had spent those 3 days not just waiting but becoming invisible. They didn't dig fighting positions. They didn't clear fields of fire. Instead, they eased themselves into the existing vegetation, allowing vines and leaves to grow around them, covering their bodies with the detritus of the jungle floor until they were indistinguishable from the environment. This wasn't camouflage. This was transformation. The techniques Byrne employed had been developed through years of trial and error, incorporating lessons learned from Aboriginal trackers who had been hunting in the Australian bush for 60,000 years. These indigenous advisors, largely ignored by American forces, had taught the SAS operators something profound about concealment. The human eye is drawn to patterns, to shapes that don't belong, to the subtle wrongness of a man-made object in a natural environment. But if you could eliminate those patterns, if you could become formless and shapeless, if you could slow your breathing and still your heartbeat until you were no more alive than the rotting log beside you, then you could achieve a level of invisibility that no amount of camouflage netting could replicate. The VC patrol walked directly into the kill zone without the slightest awareness of danger. Byrne watched them approach through eyes that hadn't blinked in 11 minutes. His breathing had slowed to 4 cycles per minute, a meditative state that reduced oxygen consumption and eliminated the chest movement that might disturb the vegetation covering his torso. His 3 teammates were equally still, equally invisible, equally ready. They had designated their targets 48 hours earlier, assigning each man 3 kills based on the probable approach route. First man takes the point element, second man takes the middle, third man takes the rear security. Fourth man, Byrne himself, takes the commander and any runners. They had rehearsed the engagement mentally thousands of times, visualizing each shot, each transition, each potential complication. And then the VC lieutenant made his fatal mistake. The officer had paused at the edge of the clearing, scanning the vegetation with the practiced eye of a man who had survived 3 years of jungle warfare. Something felt wrong. Not visibly wrong. There were no obvious signs of enemy presence. But his instincts, honed by dozens of near misses and close calls, were screaming at him to turn back. He studied the bush directly in front of him for a long moment. An unremarkable tangle of vines and broad leaves, nothing moving, nothing out of place. And yet, he stepped forward and kicked the vegetation with his boot, a casual gesture designed to flush out any hidden enemy. His boot struck Corporal Danny Morrison's shoulder. What happened next would be analyzed by American intelligence officers for months afterward. In the space of 1.8 seconds, measured by audio analysis of a recording captured from a VC radio operator, 12 aimed shots were fired. 12 bodies fell. The VC lieutenant's hand never reached his holstered pistol. His radio man never keyed his transmitter. His rear security element, 10 meters back on the trail, never turned around. They simply ceased to exist as living beings, transformed in less than 2 seconds from a functional military unit into 12 cooling corpses in the long green. But the real shock came when American advisors examined the aftermath. Staff Sergeant Hendricks arrived at the scene 4 hours after the contact, part of an intelligence team dispatched to understand what had happened. What he found challenged his fundamental understanding of infantry tactics. The shot placement on every single body was nearly identical. Center mass, just below the sternum, where the diaphragm meets the liver. Not headshots. Not the scattered pattern of automatic fire. 12 precise rounds delivered to the exact anatomical point, calculated to cause immediate incapacitation without the reflexive muscle contractions that might allow a dying man to return fire. This wasn't combat. This was execution by men who had elevated ambush warfare to a science. The Australians had already vanished, leaving nothing but shell casings and corpses. Hendricks spent 3 days trying to locate Byrne's patrol for debriefing. When he finally tracked them down at the Australian base at Nuidat, he encountered a level of professional resistance he hadn't expected from Allied forces. The Australians were unfailingly polite, professionally courteous, and absolutely unwilling to discuss their tactical methods in detail. Byrne himself, a quiet man with sun-damaged skin and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at his American visitor, answered questions with monosyllables and redirected conversations with practiced ease. The message was clear. These techniques belonged to the regiment, and they weren't for sharing. This wasn't arrogance. This was operational security born from hard experience. The Australian SAS had learned early in their Vietnam deployment that their methods were too effective to advertise. Kill ratios that exceeded American units by a factor of 10 attracted attention. The wrong kind of attention. Pentagon analysts couldn't understand how 4-man patrols were achieving results that eluded entire battalions. American commanders suspected the Australians were exaggerating their numbers, padding their statistics, maybe even counting civilian casualties as enemy dead. The truth, that Australian tactical doctrine was simply superior for this type of warfare, was too uncomfortable to accept. So the SAS stopped talking about their successes. They filed minimal after-action reports. They declined interview requests. They became ghosts in more ways than one. And their methods became the most closely guarded secret of the Vietnam War. What made the Australian approach so devastatingly effective? The answer lies in a fundamental philosophical difference between American and Australian military culture. American doctrine in Vietnam emphasized technological superiority, helicopters for mobility, artillery for support, air power for decisive engagement. The Australian doctrine emphasized something far older and far more primal: the skills of the hunter. Where American forces saw the jungle as an obstacle to be overcome with firepower, Australian forces saw it as a weapon to be wielded against the enemy. Where American patrols moved quickly to cover ground, Australian patrols moved slowly to understand ground. Where American ambushes relied on volume of fire, Australian ambushes relied on precision of fire. The results spoke for themselves in blood and body counts. During their deployment to Vietnam, Australian SAS patrols achieved a kill ratio that remains classified to this day. Conservative estimates suggest they eliminated over 500 enemy combatants while suffering fewer than 20 casualties of their own. Some intelligence analysts put the real numbers significantly higher. For comparison, American LRRP teams operating in the same province during the same period achieved kill ratios roughly 1/10 as favorable. The Australians were doing something different, something better, and the Pentagon couldn't figure out what it was. But we can now reveal what they were too proud to admit. The Australian advantage began with selection. Where American Special Operations Units selected for physical fitness and aggression, the Australian SAS selected for something harder to measure. What they called Phuoc, quote, 3. Candidates were evaluated not just on their ability to complete grueling physical challenges, but on their capacity for stillness, for patience, for the predatory calm that allowed a man to lie motionless in insect-infested vegetation for days at a time. Many physically superior candidates washed out because they couldn't master the psychological discipline required. Many smaller, quieter men succeeded because they understood instinctively what the jungle demanded. The training that followed was unlike anything in the American military system. Australian SAS candidates spent weeks living with Aboriginal trackers in the Australian outback, learning hunting techniques developed over millennia. They learned to read disturbed vegetation the way a scholar reads text, understanding from a broken twig or a crushed leaf. Not just that someone had passed, but when they had passed. How many there were, how fast they were moving, whether they were confident or afraid. They learned to move through bush so quietly that kangaroos wouldn't startle at their passage. They learned to control their breathing, their heartbeat, their very presence, until they could approach within arm's length of a wild animal without detection. These weren't military skills, these were predator skills. When these techniques were applied to human prey in Vietnam, the results were devastating. Australian patrols could track VC units for days without being detected, learning their patterns, identifying their camps, mapping their supply routes. They could establish ambush positions so perfectly concealed that enemy patrols would literally walk over hidden operators without knowing they were there. They could remain in position for periods that American forces considered impossible. 10 days, 12 days, even longer. Surviving on minimal rations and collected rainwater while they waited for the perfect moment to strike. And when that moment came, the killing was surgical. The ghost ambush that eliminated the 12-man VC patrol wasn't an anomaly. It was standard operating procedure for Australian SAS units. Every patrol practiced the technique until it became automatic. The silent wait, the coordinated initiation, the precise shot placement, the immediate extraction. American observers who witnessed these ambushes reported feeling disturbed by their clinical efficiency. There was no battle fury, no adrenaline-fueled chaos, no fog of war. Just calm, methodical elimination of human beings by men who had trained themselves to feel nothing in the moment of killing. This psychological transformation was perhaps the most controversial aspect of Australian methods. American military psychologists who studied Australian SAS operators noted significant differences in how they processed combat. Where American soldiers often experienced intense emotional responses during and after engagements, fear, rage, exhilaration, guilt. Australian SAS veterans described a detached, almost mechanical state during operations. They had trained themselves to suppress the normal human responses to violence, to become pure instruments of their tactical mission. Some American observers found this admirable. Others found it profoundly disturbing. A few quietly suggested that men who could kill with such cold efficiency had perhaps lost something essential to their humanity. The Australians didn't care what Americans thought. Their job was to eliminate enemy combatants and protect their mates. Everything else, the moral questions, the psychological implications, the uncomfortable comparisons to predators rather than soldiers, was irrelevant to the mission. They had been given an impossible task: control a province larger than some American states with fewer than 500 combat troops against an enemy that numbered in the thousands. They had developed methods that worked, and if those methods made American observers uncomfortable, that was an American problem, not an Australian one. But the ghost ambush technique had implications that extended far beyond that jungle clearing. Intelligence captured from VC units operating in Phuoc Tui province revealed the psychological impact of Australian methods. Enemy commanders had begun avoiding areas where Australian patrols operated, even when those areas contained strategically important objectives. VC soldiers reported nightmares about, quote, the jungle ghosts, who could appear from nowhere and vanish without trace. Morale in units assigned to the Australian sector dropped measurably compared to those facing American forces. The Viet Cong had learned to respect American firepower. They had learned to fear Australian patience. The distinction was crucial to understanding the different approaches. American forces made the jungle dangerous through technology: mines, sensors, defoliants, airstrikes. They tried to reshape the environment to suit their capabilities. Australian forces made themselves dangerous within the jungle as it existed. They didn't try to change the terrain. They mastered it. They didn't rely on supporting arms. They became self-sufficient hunters who needed nothing but their weapons, their skills, and their willingness to wait. In a war where the enemy knew the terrain better than any foreign force could hope to learn it, the Australians found a way to become more native than the natives. This philosophy manifested in every aspect of their operations. Australian patrols carried minimal equipment: no heavy radios, no extra ammunition, no comfort items. They ate cold rations to avoid cooking fires. They drank collected water to avoid the noise of canteens. They communicated through hand signals developed from Aboriginal hunting parties, allowing coordination without a single spoken word. They treated every patrol as a hunting expedition, with the understanding that the prey was intelligent, experienced, and capable of turning the tables if given any advantage. This wasn't warfare as Americans understood it. This was something older and more primal, and the results were changing the course of the war in their sector. By 1967, the Australian task force had achieved something that eluded American commanders throughout Vietnam: genuine population security in their area of operations. Villages in Phuoc Tui province that had been firmly under VC control began cooperating with government forces. intelligence from civilian sources increased dramatically. Enemy logistical operations in the province were disrupted to the point of near collapse. American analysts studying the phenomenon couldn't understand how such a small force was achieving such disproportionate results. The answer was simple. The Australians had made the jungle more dangerous for the enemy than for the civilians, inverting the normal guerrilla warfare equation. But this success came with costs that wouldn't be fully understood for decades. The men who mastered the ghost ambush technique, who trained themselves to kill without hesitation and vanish without trace, carried those skills and that psychology home with them. Many struggled to readjust to civilian life. The predatory calm that served them so well in the long green became a barrier to normal human connection. The ability to suppress emotional response during violence sometimes extended to an inability to feel emotional response at all. Some veterans described feeling like strangers in their own country, men who had become something other than ordinary Australians during their time in the jungle. Sergeant Terry Byrne was among them. After his second tour, Byrne returned to Australia and attempted to resume the civilian life he had left behind. He had been a plumber's apprentice before conscription, a quiet young man from suburban Adelaide with no particular ambitions beyond learning his trade and eventually starting a family. The man who returned from Vietnam bore the same name and wore the same face, but something fundamental had changed. He couldn't explain it to his family. He couldn't explain it to the psychologists who evaluated returning veterans. He couldn't even fully explain it to himself. He had spent 2 years becoming a perfect jungle predator, and now he was expected to become an ordinary suburban Australian again. The transition proved impossible for many of his generation. Australian Vietnam veterans experienced rates of psychological trauma comparable to their American counterparts, despite, or perhaps because of, the different nature of their warfare. The intimacy of their killing, the extended periods of isolated patrol, the psychological discipline required to transform themselves into hunters of men. All of these factors contributed to a unique pattern of post-war difficulty. They had been too effective at becoming something other than normal soldiers. And the skills that made them legendary in the jungle made them strangers in their own society. But in 1967, none of that lay in the visible future. What mattered was the mission, and the mission was being accomplished with a ruthless efficiency that American forces couldn't match. Staff Sergeant Hendricks filed his report on the ghost ambush, noting the extraordinary tactical discipline displayed by the Australian patrol. He recommended that American LRRP teams study Australian methods and consider adapting them for U.S. operations. His recommendation was noted, filed, and quietly ignored. American military culture couldn't accept that a bunch of Australians with World War II-era rifles were outperforming the most technologically advanced military force in human history. The rivalry between American and Australian special operations would continue throughout the war. Massey VSOG commanders repeatedly requested joint operations with Australian SAS units, hoping to learn their techniques through direct observation. The Australians politely declined most of these requests, citing operational security concerns that were only partially genuine. The truth was that Australian methods required a fundamentally different mindset, one that couldn't be taught in a few joint patrols. American special operators were selected and trained to be aggressive, initiative-taking warriors who dominated through action. Australian operators were selected and trained to be patient, observant hunters who dominated through stillness. The two approaches were philosophically incompatible, and so the ghost ambush remained an Australian secret. Decades later, military historians would recognize the Australian SAS experience in Vietnam as one of the most successful counterinsurgency campaigns in modern warfare. Their methods, patience over firepower, precision over volume, hunting over fighting, would eventually influence special operations doctrine worldwide. But in 1967, those lessons were being written in blood and silence, by small patrols of quiet men who had learned to become one with the jungle. The VC officer who kicked that bush never knew he was testing the most dangerous ambush technique of the entire war. His boot struck human flesh, and in the 1.8 seconds that followed, he and 11 of his comrades ceased to exist. No warning, no chance to fight back, no dramatic last stand or heroic resistance, just the clinical application of skills developed over millennia of human hunting, deployed by men who had trained themselves to feel nothing until the killing was done. The ghost ambush worked exactly as designed, transforming a routine patrol into a massacre so swift and complete that it seemed supernatural to those who examined the aftermath. But there was nothing supernatural about it. Just 4 Australians who had mastered the oldest form of warfare, the hunt, and applied it with devastating precision to the most dangerous prey of all. They had spent 3 days becoming invisible. They had waited with the patience of predators who knew their prey would eventually come. They had killed with the efficiency of men who had rehearsed every shot 1,000 times in their minds. And then they had vanished back into the long green, leaving nothing but 12 bodies and a mystery that would puzzle American intelligence for months to come. The jungle ghost ambush remains one of the most closely studied tactical innovations of the Vietnam War. Modern Special Operations Forces trained techniques directly descended from those 4-man Australian patrols. The emphasis on patience over aggression, on precision over volume, on becoming invisible rather than overwhelming. All of these concepts trace their lineage back to the long green and the quiet men who hunted there. What the Australians discovered in Vietnam was something that American military doctrine had forgotten. That sometimes the most effective warrior is not the one with the most firepower, but the one with the most patience. Staff Sergeant Hendricks never forgot what he witnessed in that jungle clearing. Years later, after multiple tours and a career that took him to special operations commands across 3 continents, he would tell younger soldiers about the 12 VC bodies arranged in that perfect kill radius, about the boot frozen mid-step, about the shot placement so precise it seemed impossible, about the 4 Australians who had achieved in 2 seconds what American battalions couldn't accomplish in 2 weeks. And he would always end with the same observation. The most dangerous thing in that jungle wasn't the enemy, the terrain, or the diseases that claimed more American lives than combat. The most dangerous thing was 4 quiet Australians who had learned to become invisible. The ghost ambush technique that eliminated that 12-man VC patrol represented more than tactical innovation. It represented a fundamental challenge to American assumptions about how wars should be fought. The United States military in Vietnam relied on technological superiority, overwhelming firepower, and aggressive tactics to achieve its objectives. The Australian SAS achieved superior results with inferior resources by embracing a completely different philosophy, one based on patience, precision, and the ancient skills of the hunter. Their success suggested that perhaps the American way of war wasn't the only way, or even the best way, to defeat a guerrilla enemy in difficult terrain. This was a lesson that American military culture was not prepared to learn. The ghost ambush files were eventually classified, not because they contained information useful to the enemy, but because they contained information embarrassing to American commanders. The kill ratios achieved by Australian SAS patrols made American LRRP teams look ineffective by comparison. The tactical innovations developed by men like Sergeant Byrne challenged fundamental assumptions about special operations that American doctrine wasn't ready to question. Better to bury the reports than to confront what they implied about the relative effectiveness of Allied forces. And so the legend of the ghost ambush passed into whispered history. Veterans who served alongside Australian SAS units would tell stories in bars and reunions about the things they witnessed: the impossible patience, the superhuman stillness, the clinical killing efficiency that seemed more predator than soldier. American special operators who had been humbled by Australian methods would incorporate fragments of those techniques into their own training, passing down lessons learned in the long green to new generations of warriors. But the full story of what the Australians accomplished in Vietnam remained largely untold, classified, or forgotten, known only to those who had been there. Until now. The ghost ambush that began with a VC officer kicking an _5_ bush was not an isolated incident. It was the product of a tactical philosophy developed through years of experimentation, refined through combat experience, and executed with a precision that challenged everything American forces thought they knew about jungle warfare. 4 men achieved in 2 seconds what battalions couldn't accomplish in weeks. And they did it by embracing something older than modern military doctrine: the ancient skills of the hunter, adapted for the most dangerous prey of all. The 12 VC soldiers who walked into that ambush never had a chance. Their commander was experienced. Their formation was tactically sound. Their security was alert. None of it mattered. They were facing an enemy that had spent 3 days becoming invisible, that had rehearsed their deaths 1,000 times, that felt nothing when the moment came except the calm satisfaction of a successful hunt. The ghost ambush worked because it was designed to work against exactly this kind of target: experienced, alert, confident fighters who knew how to detect American ambushes but had never encountered anything like the Australian approach. And when that officer's boot struck Corporal Morrison's shoulder, the response was instant and final. 12 aimed shots, 12 bodies, 1.8 seconds. No return fire, no survivors, no warning that might allow future patrols to avoid the same fate. Just clinical, efficient elimination by men who had transformed themselves into jungle predators. The ghost ambush was not just a tactical technique, it was a demonstration of what human beings could become when they embraced the oldest form of warfare and applied it with modern precision. The jungle ghost ambush changed the way special operations forces think about concealment, patience, and precision engagement. Its influence extends far beyond the long green of Phuoc province, shaping doctrine and training in elite units worldwide. But for the 12 men who ceased to exist on that March morning in 1967, and for the 4 Australians who vanished back into the jungle afterward, it was simply another patrol. Another successful hunt. Another small victory in a war that would ultimately be decided by factors far beyond the control of any 4-man patrol, no matter how skilled. The ghost ambush remains a testament to what small units of highly trained individuals can accomplish against numerically superior forces. It demonstrates that tactical innovation, psychological discipline, and mastery of terrain can overcome technological advantages and numerical superiority. It suggests that perhaps the most important weapons in any conflict are not helicopters, artillery, or air support, but the skills, patience, and predatory instincts of the individual warrior. And it serves as a reminder that even in an age of technological warfare, the oldest hunting techniques known to humanity remain devastatingly effective against the most dangerous prey of all. Staff Sergeant Hendricks understood this when he stood in that jungle clearing, surrounded by 12 bodies arranged in a perfect kill radius. He understood that he was witnessing something that challenged his fundamental assumptions about combat, about special operations, about what it meant to be elite. The 4 Australians who had accomplished this feat weren't physically imposing supermen. They weren't equipped with advanced technology. They weren't supported by overwhelming firepower. They were simply men who had mastered the art of becoming invisible, of waiting with inhuman patience, of killing with precision that bordered on the mechanical. And they had done it all in less than 2 seconds. The ghost ambush technique developed by Australian SAS operators in Vietnam represents one of the most significant tactical innovations in the history of special operations warfare. Its emphasis on concealment over firepower, patience over aggression, and precision over volume would eventually reshape how elite units worldwide approach ambush operations. But for the men who developed and perfected these techniques in the long green, there was no thought of historical significance or doctrinal innovation. There was only the mission, the hunt, and the quiet satisfaction of watching prey walk into a perfectly prepared trap. The VC officer who kicked that empty bush triggered more than an ambush. He triggered a demonstration of human capability that would echo through decades of military history, influencing training and doctrine in ways he could never have imagined as his body fell. His final act, a routine security check born of hard-won combat experience, inadvertently revealed to American observers what Australian SAS operators were capable of achieving, and that revelation would eventually contribute to a fundamental re-examination of special operations doctrine that continues to this day. But in that moment, in that jungle clearing, there was only the kill. 12 shots, 12 bodies, 4 ghosts vanishing into the long green. And one American observer left to wonder how a plumber's apprentice from Adelaide had become the most effective jungle predator he had ever witnessed. The ghost ambush worked because it was designed by men who understood something fundamental about warfare that their American allies had forgotten. That sometimes the most devastating weapon is not firepower or technology, but patience, skill, and the willingness to become something other than human in pursuit of the kill. And that was the secret of the Australian SAS ghost ambush.